Mr. Carpiello, are you ready for opening statement?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. You may proceed.
May please court, counsel. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, congratulations or condolences for making these comfortable chairs. And now you're going to get to hear about the facts of the case that we were sort of talking around during the past 2 days of jury selection. What you're going to hear is, in this case, is different than a lot of the other cases that happen in this courthouse. Because instead of boxes of documents and complicated charts and graphs, what you're going to see in this case is the last moments of James Peoples' life. You're going to be able to see with your own eyes the moment that this defendant, Delinord Dumercy, made a decision to act, made a decision to take James Peoples' life, acted on that decision, and fired 2 fatal shots into Mr. Peoples. You're going to see that the moment that the defendant decided that if he couldn't have his ex-girlfriend, Darnisha McCrae, who's also the mother of his child at the time, James Peoples certainly could. And you're going to see him shoot Mr. Peoples, flee the scene. And later what you'll hear is the next day the defendant goes to the Delray Beach Police Department and he talks to the Delray Beach Police Department. He admits that yes, in fact, he's the one that shot Mr. Peoples. You'll hear him tell the police that at the time that he shot Mr. Peoples, he felt threatened. He'll tell the police that he felt that Mr. Peoples had shot at him 11 days prior, and he felt that he was in fear for his life. But over the course of that interview, you will hear him start to begin to tell the truth. You'll hear him begin to tell the police that he was mad that Mr. Peoples was interfering with the relationship that he had with Darnisha McCrae, that he wanted to hurt Mr. Peoples, that he wanted to cripple Mr. Peoples, he wanted to punch him in the face. He was mad that this guy was interfering. You'll hear him tell the police ultimately that he wanted to kill Mr. Peoples for interfering in his relationship. Because of his decision, he stands before you charged with the crime of first-degree premeditated murder. And to prove the crime of first-degree premeditated murder, what the state has to prove to you through evidence, testimony, witnesses, and the circumstances surrounding the case is that this defendant did some type of criminal act to take Mr. Peoples' life. The act itself was unlawful, and he did so with a premeditated intent, or he had an opportunity to reflect on his actions and make a conscious decision to act and take Mr. Peoples' life. And because he tells the police that he's acting in self-defense, the state then has to prove to you that this was not an act in self-defense, that this was that the defendant either was not in fear of death or imminent bodily or great bodily injury, and that fear was not a reasonable fear even if he was in fear. It is a fear that you as a jury would reject as being reasonable. And that's what we'll do through the course of the witnesses, the testimony, and some of the digital evidence that you'll see in this case. And you will know at the end of this case that this is not a case of self-defense. This is a case of self-offense. This is a case of this man allowing his rage, his anger, his jealousy, and his hatred for Mr. Peoples, his anger at Ms. McCrae, his anger at his relationship, overcome him, act, and take a young man's life. So you're going to hear from Darnisha McCrae. Ms. McCrae will tell you a little bit about the relationship that she had with this defendant. She'll tell you that the defendant and Ms. McCrae had been dating since about high school, since around 2011. This shooting takes place in 2016. You're going to hear that this shooting takes place on December 8th, 2016. Ms. McCrae will tell you that she had been dating the defendant since around 2011, but she'd also been friends with the victim in this case, Mr. Peoples, since around the 7th grade. So moving forward to 2016, you're going to hear that Ms. McCrae and the defendant's relationship began to fall apart. They weren't dating anymore, but they were still talking. And one of the ways that they were talking was through text messages, through phone calls, occasionally seeing each other. But as their relationship begins to fall apart, Darnisha falls pregnant, and you'll find that she becomes pregnant with the defendant's child. But you'll find out through her testimony and through some of the text messages that she sends to the defendant, in no uncertain terms, she does not want to be with him anymore. And you'll see how that affected the defendant. You'll see how his reaction was to that. The way you'll see this is through some screenshots from Ms. McCrae's phone that she provides to law enforcement, as well as what's called a forensic extraction, or a dump of the defendant's phone that occurs after he is taken into custody at the police station the day after the shooting. So the shooting, again, takes place December 8th of 2016. One of the first text messages that you will see is from November 6th of 2016, a month before, when the defendant sends a message to Ms. McCrae. Say goodbye to that person. And I'm not going to use the language that he uses, but you'll be able to see the language that he uses. Say goodbye to that person. He won't live long. That's on everything. A month before the shooting. The first threat that's ever made in this case is from this defendant towards the victim. 2 days later, you'll see text messages where the defendant tells Ms. McCrae, basically tells her off. He tells her, I hope you have a miscarriage. I don't care for you anymore. And then what you'll see through the defendant's phone extraction is that Darnisha tells him, that's the real you talking. I hope you die first. James already wants to kill you. 2 minutes later, you'll see a text message from this defendant saying, tell him to bring his chrome or bring his gun because I've been wanting this. Next time I see him, I'll put a bullet through his head. 1 month before he shoots James Peoples twice at a gas station on Atlantic and Congress, he tells Darnisha, tell him to bring his gun because I'll put a bullet through his head. A few days later, about a week later, November 14th, you'll see a text message from the defendant to Ms. McCrae. If I can't have you, no one will. I ain't got nothing to lose. I will end anyone you are with. On December 2nd of 2016, so now we're a little bit less than a week before the shooting, the defendant texts Darnisha again. If you think I'll let you be with him, you don't know me well. I'm not the only one after him. It's only a matter of time until we find him and his kid. I don't care. I just want to kill Mr. Peoples, and then you can be with anyone you want. How about you bring him to a park and see if it's a game? We're out here. 2 days later, he texts Ms. McCrae again. I found where Mr. Peoples lives. There's going to be a lot of blood tonight. I am never going to let you be in a relationship. And then what you'll see is Ms. McCrae has text messages, but again, the defendant has text messages that the police are able to obtain. Right after he texts Darnisha, I found out where James lives. There's a lot of blood tonight. He texts another person. He says, I'm in the shores. I've got my strap or I've got my gun so we can handle that. I'm trying to kill that fool tonight. Bring yours in case his homeboys cause problems. And the person that he texts isn't the person that he thought he texts, so he gets a text back that says, this is Sean, and the defendant says, ignore that text. So then moving to the day of the shooting, an hour before the shooting, the defendant sends a text message to Ms. McCrae. You have your boyfriend. He uses different language again. Look, honey, it's war. Nothing but. So then what happened? About an hour after that text message, you'll see video from a Chevron gas station. And this Chevron gas station is on Atlantic and Congress. Ms. McCrae will identify the people in the video, but you'll get a chance to observe both the full video as well as different parts of the video. You'll hear that shortly before what is depicted on the video, Mr. Peoples, Ms. McCrae, her brother, or younger brother DeAndre, are driving back from dropping DeAndre's brother's girlfriend off at her house. They see the defendant riding his bicycle on Atlantic Avenue. And Ms. McCrae is driving the vehicle, a blue vehicle. She stops her car at a local plaza, and Mr. Peoples gets out of the car and raises his hands to the defendant, like, what's going on? The defendant leaves. What you'll then see is the defendant is on a bicycle. He pulls up to a Chevron gas station, and it's a well-lit Chevron gas station. You'll see people, you'll see a couple minutes before everything takes place, you'll see people coming and going from the gas station. You'll see that it's a place of safety. It's well-lit. There's other people there. There's doors that lock. You'll see the defendant coming into the gas station, and you'll see at the time that he comes into the gas station, he has a black backpack. And that black backpack is going to be the backpack that contains the 9mm gun that he told the police he bought a few days before, because if you saw James Peoples, someone's going to die. You'll see as he walks into that gas station, he starts to go to the I believe it is the west door. So he comes in the east door and he walks towards the west door. And he's already reaching into that backpack. When he goes to that west door, you'll see that the door is locked. So he turns around, he pulls the gun out of his backpack, he shoves one of the customers out of the way. During this time, you'll see that Mr. Peoples is walking up to the gas station. He has no weapons in his hands. His hands are down at his sides. Palms are extended. You'll see this defendant push one of the customers out of the way, open the door to that gas station convenience center, fire the first shot into James Peoples. And you'll hear testimony from Dr. Mote, the medical examiner. He'll tell you the first shot hit Mr. Peoples in the neck. You'll see Mr. Peoples turns to flee, to run away. And at that point, you'll see this defendant run after Mr. Peoples and fire a second shot into Mr. Peoples' back. Dr. Mote will tell you that because of the angle that the gunshot took place at and because of the way everyone was sort of positioned at the time, that gunshot was the more serious gunshot. That gunshot was the fatal gunshot that ended up penetrating most of Mr. Peoples' vital organs and ultimately causing his death. You'll be able to see and hear from some of the first responders that arrive on scene. You'll be able to see some body camera footage of some of the first responders as they try in vain to provide medical attention or medical care for Mr. Peoples. You'll see that after shooting Mr. Peoples twice, the defendant stands over Mr. Peoples. Mr. Peoples grabs for his leg. The defendant continues trying to fire at him before running up the street. And when the defendant runs up the street, what he does is he throws that gun away. And in the course of talking to the police, he will tell the police where he threw the gun away. And sure enough, the police find that firearm right where he said it would be. You'll hear testimony from the crime scene investigators, and they will testify and they'll tell you what they do to recover some of the physical evidence, the bullets, the projectile part of a bullet, the casing part of a bullet. You'll learn, if you don't already know, you'll learn what those are. You will hear that, you'll hear through the course of the evidence that the police, after the defendant arrived and after the defendant made his statement, they retrieved his phone. You'll hear about some of the analysis of the defendant's phone. You'll hear that although the defendant tells the police that he was in fear because he was shot at 11 days before the shooting that he is charged with, you'll hear that there are no calls.
Does gentleman object to approach?
Yes.
So during the forensic analysis of the phone, although the defendant says that he was shot at 11 days before, you'll see that through the course of those 11 days, the defendant never calls the police to report that there was a shooting. You'll see the defendant has frequent contacts with Darnisha McCrae, but never once does he mention, hey, James Peoples tried to shoot at me, he missed. You'll see that the defendant actually sends his address to Darnisha several times. You'll see that he never texts, or through an analysis of his whole phone, he never tells anybody that he had been shot at. The only person that he tells the police after he shoots Mr. Peoples twice in a public place in full view of people that know him and complete strangers. When you hear all of the evidence in the case, at the close of all the evidence in the case, the state will prove to you beyond the exclusion of every reasonable doubt that this defendant committed first-degree premeditated murder, that he acted not in self-defense, but he acted in self-offense, that he chose to do what he had been threatening to do for months and take Mr. Peoples' life, and he acted on that, and you will find him guilty as charged of first-degree premeditated murder. Thank you.
Thank you.